The kitchen was not a room you passed through. It was where the day began, before the sun, before everything else, and in many houses, it was the last room of the night. The woman who ran that kitchen knew the smell of lye soap on her hands at 9 in the morning. She knew the weight of a wrung-out rag grabbed in a hurry because the icebox drip pan had overflowed again. She knew how flour sticks to your ankles when the dough goes wrong. She knew that a pot of beans turns against you in exactly 7 minutes if you walk away from it. There was always something on the edge of burning. There was always a task half finished that could not be abandoned, and another task waiting the moment that one was done. The kitchen was not a convenience, it was a production facility, run by one person, mostly without help, from before sunrise until after the dinner dishes were dry. Sometime in the mid-20s, a researcher named Maud Wilson at Oregon State Agricultural College asked 513 farm women to keep a daily log of every hour of domestic work they performed for 1 week. She compiled the numbers and published the findings. The average housewife performed 53 hours of housework per week. A farm housewife added 12 more hours on top of that for farm-specific work. 65 hours per week, without pay, without overtime, without sick leave, without the option of not showing up because the work could not wait. Now read that number again, but this time think about the hands that generated it. Most of those hours lived in the kitchen, acquiring food, preparing food, preserving food, storing food, cooking it 3 times every single day, and cleaning everything up when it was done. In a house without a mechanical refrigerator, and in those years almost no house had one, food required constant attention. Nothing could simply sit. Everything either kept or it spoiled. This is what that kitchen actually demanded. And the story of how it changed, how a kitchen went from the most labor-intensive room in a house to a room where dinner can be ready in 20 minutes, is the story of how modern life was assembled, one appliance at a time.
Everything in the 1925 kitchen began with heat. Before any meal could be started, before coffee could be made, before bread could be baked, before a pot of beans could simmer, someone had to make a fire. And in 1925, most American households outside of cities were still managing that fire in a wood-burning or coal-burning cast iron stove. The cast iron stove was not a simple machine. It was a system that required daily maintenance. Each morning, the ash box had to be checked, sometimes emptied, always managed. The dampers had to be set to control the draft. The firebox had to be fed. Getting the temperature right for baking required experience, opening and closing vents, adjusting the wood, reading the behavior of the flame. There was no dial to turn. There was no number to set. There was accumulated knowledge applied every morning to a system that behaved differently depending on the wood, the weather, the humidity, and how recently the flue had been cleaned. Stove maintenance was not a small task. It has been estimated that managing a coal or wood stove, feeding it, adjusting it, emptying its ash box twice daily, blacking it with wax to prevent rusting, occupied 4 or more hours of a housewife's day in the 19th century. By 1925, improvements in stove design had reduced this, but not eliminated it. The fire still had to be started every morning and managed all day. In urban kitchens, this was changing. Gas stoves, which required no kindling, no ash management, no daily blacking, had been spreading through American cities since the early 1900s. By the 1920s, gas cooking was becoming the standard in urban areas. A gas burner offered something the wood stove never could, a flame that appeared the moment you wanted it and disappeared the moment you didn't. No waiting for heat to build, no fire to tend. But for the majority of American households, still rural, still outside the gas infrastructure, the wood or coal stove remained the center of the kitchen in 1925.
The fire had to be lit before dawn, the kitchen had to warm from whatever temperature the night had left it. And the day's cooking had to be planned around what the stove could do, not the other way around.
In the corner of the kitchen, or sometimes fitted into a nook built into the exterior wall to borrow the cold air from outside, sat the icebox. Not a refrigerator, a wooden cabinet lined with tin or zinc, insulated with sawdust or cork, with a compartment near the top holding a large block of ice. Cold air fell from the ice into the lower section where the food lived. The food stayed cool as long as the ice held. The ice never held long enough. By midsummer, a block could be gone in under 24 hours, and beneath every icebox there was the drip pan, a shallow tray collecting the meltwater as the ice slowly became water, became nothing. That pan had to be emptied at least once a day. In hot weather, more. If it was forgotten, it overflowed. There is something almost cruel about the sound that an icebox made on a July afternoon, that slow, patient drip against the tin lining. Clink, clink, clink. It was the clock of that kitchen, and every drop that hit the pan was a small piece of money going with it, because ice cost money. The iceman charged by the block, 25, 50, 75, or 100 pounds, and every pound of that block became water on the kitchen floor if someone wasn't paying attention. The anxiety of the icebox was never just about temperature. It was about the meat that might be 12 hours from turning. It was about the milk that had arrived that morning and by 3 in the afternoon was a gamble. It was about waking up in the middle of the night and realizing, did I empty the pan? A flooded kitchen floor was a consequence of forgetting, and it happened. In summer, in households where the days were long and the tasks were endless, it happened. An electric refrigerator did exist, the kind that maintained consistent cold automatically, without deliveries or drip pans or any of this. But the first models cost between $450 and $1,000 at a time when the average American worker earned less than $2,000 a year. In 1923, there were approximately 20,000 electric refrigerators in American homes, in a country of more than 100 million people. The Freon refrigerant that would finally make them safe, quiet, and affordable wasn't developed until 1928. So the kitchen managed with a wooden box and a block of ice delivered by a man with iron tongs, and listened to the ice going away, drop by drop, while trying to concentrate on dinner. Between the stove and the icebox stood the piece of furniture that defined that kitchen more than anything else, the Hoosier cabinet. Named after the Hoosier Manufacturing Company of Indiana, though the name had gone generic the way Kleenex and Xerox would later go generic. The Hoosier cabinet was the decade's answer to a kitchen problem that had no structural solution. Most American kitchens had a stove, a sink, a table, and shelves. There was no counter in the modern sense. Flour lived in the pantry, sugar on a shelf across the room, rolling pins and utensils scattered between drawers. Getting everything together before you could begin mixing required walking repeatedly back and forth across a kitchen that was rarely large enough to justify the distance. Think about making bread before the Hoosier arrived. Flour, trip to the pantry. Sugar, trip to the far shelf. Salt, another shelf. Rolling pin, a drawer somewhere else. You crossed that kitchen 6 times before your hands were in the dough. The Hoosier cabinet put everything in one place. The upper section held a flour bin with a built-in sifter. You opened the door and the flour fell in a thin white stream directly onto the work surface below, with a soft metallic rasp as the screen turned against the frame. It smelled like stored grain, like winter prepared for, like work that was going to turn out right. Beside it, the sugar bin, spice jars behind glass doors. The work surface itself, enamel or zinc, cool and smooth, was exactly where you needed it. The lower section, drawers over pots, linens, utensils. Some models had a pull-out pastry board. Some had glass canisters for coffee, tea and rice visible through the doors. 2 million of them had been sold across the country by that point. Roughly 1 in 10 households owned one. The advertisements promised to save miles of steps, and that was not an exaggeration. What made the Hoosier cabinet's timing remarkable was what was happening around it. Between 1910 and 1920, the number of people employed as domestic servants dropped from 1,850,000 to 1,410,000, while the number of American households grew by more than 4 million. The women who had managed their kitchens with help were now managing them alone. The knowledge, the labor, the physical daily presence, all of it fell to one person. The Hoosier cabinet arrived exactly when that person needed it most. That sound of flour sifting, that dry metallic whisper of the built-in screen doing its work, for anyone who lived with one of these, it was the sound of a small problem solved, a minor daily victory in a day full of things that could go wrong.
A weekday in a 1925 kitchen started before dawn. The fire came first. The stove needed time to reach cooking temperature, and nothing else happened until it had heat. While the fire built, the icebox was checked. Was there enough ice? Was anything in there approaching spoilage? Did the drip pan need emptying before the day's work began? Then, coffee. Breakfast. The first full production of the day, requiring planning even for something as routine as eggs and bread. What was in the icebox? What was still good from yesterday? What needed to be used before it turned? After breakfast came the cleaning, and then the planning for dinner, which in a household without refrigeration required that the meat be fresh, acquired that morning if possible. Meat that had been in the icebox 2 days was pressing the limit of safekeeping. The morning trip to the butcher was not a shopping habit, it was a technical requirement of food safety. The midday meal, dinner in the 1920s usage, with supper being the lighter evening meal in many households, was another full production, often the heaviest meal of the day. Then the remains of dinner needed to be managed, wrapped in cloth, returned to the icebox, or repurposed. Waste was a constant concern in a household where nothing could be reliably kept, and food was a measurable fraction of the weekly budget. And then supper, and the dishes, and if it was Monday, the laundry. If it was Tuesday, the ironing. If it was Saturday, the baking. Bread, pies, biscuits enough to last through the week, produced in a single session of sustained work beginning early morning and ending when the last loaves came out of the oven. 53 hours per week. Maud Wilson's number is not abstract when you map it against what filling each of those hours actually required.
Careful with that one, it looks like it might crack. How many more baskets are there, Ma? It's boiling in here.
In 1925, cooking from scratch was not a choice. It was the only option. There were canned goods in the grocery store, canned tomatoes, canned corn, evaporated milk, canned beans. The first packaged foods had begun appearing. Jell-O had been introduced in 1897, Crisco shortening in 1911. Aunt Jemima pancake flour had been on shelves since the 1890s. By 1925, a housewife shopping at an A&P could find a modest but growing shelf of packaged and processed products. But the basis of every meal, the bread, the soup, the pie crust, the gravy, the biscuits, the beans, was made in the kitchen, from basic ingredients, by whoever was running the kitchen that day. There was no alternative. There were no frozen meals. There were no prepared entrees. There were no boxed dinner kits. There were no drive-thrus. This meant that cooking required skill, real skill, developed over years, transmitted through observation and practice from one generation to the next. A woman who did not know how to make bread, to judge when the dough had risen enough, when the yeast had done its work, when the crust had reached the right color without cutting into the loaf to check, faced a practical problem that could not be solved by looking it up. In 1925, radio existed but was not yet a cooking medium. Cooking schools were available but expensive. The knowledge that made a kitchen run was either learned at home or enrolled for in a home economics class, if one was available. The home economics movement, formalized in 1899 and funded by federal law from 1917 through the Smith-Hughes Act, was explicitly designed to turn the accumulated domestic knowledge of generations into teachable, transferable curriculum. By 1925, federal county extension agents were operating in rural Ohio and across the country, teaching nutrition, cooking technique, canning procedures, and household management to women who had access to neither cooking school nor helpful mothers-in-law. The goal was not to make housekeeping simpler in the modern sense. The goal was to make it scientific, to apply to the kitchen the same kind of systematic thinking that industry applied to manufacturing. A kitchen run by informed principles, not guesswork, would waste less, feed better, and consume fewer hours. Whether it succeeded is a different question.
Every summer and every fall, something happened in American kitchens that consumed weeks of work and filled an entire pantry shelf. Canning. It was not a hobby. It was the line between eating and not eating in February. Without a mechanical freezer, which didn't exist in any household form before the late 30s, and with an electric refrigerator that was still a luxury beyond reach, the only way to carry the summer's tomatoes, green beans, corn, peaches, and berries into winter was to seal them in glass jars and boil them. Every jar a small act of survival, performed in batches over a stove running at full heat in a kitchen that was already warm from everything else happening in it. The mason jar, patented by John Landis Mason in 1858 and still in steady production, was the essential vessel. Vegetables were blanched, packed, sealed, and processed in a boiling water bath for a precise amount of time, different for every vegetable, critical to get right, because getting it wrong had real consequences. Clostridium botulinum, the bacterium that produces botulism toxin, thrives in exactly the conditions of an improperly processed jar. No oxygen, no sufficient acidity, a sealed container that looks perfectly fine from the outside. The difference between a safe jar and a dangerous one was not always visible until someone opened it. Every woman who canned knew this, not as an abstract fact, as something that sat in the back of the mind every time a lid was placed on a rim. And then there was the moment that made all of it worth it. After the jars came out of the water bath, they were set in a row on a cloth on the counter, still hot to cool. The kitchen went quiet, or nearly so. And then, as the cooling contents contracted and the lid was pulled down from the inside by the forming vacuum, came the sound. Click. That small, clean, unmistakable sound. The lid sealing, the vacuum holding. That jar was closed. That tomato, that peach, that green bean was going to make it through winter. One by one down the row. Click, click, click. A full season of canning produced dozens of jars, sometimes more than 100. Tomatoes alone, for a family that depended on them for winter soups and stews, could require 30 to 50 quarts. Green beans, corn, peaches, applesauce, pickles, each had its season and its window, and the window didn't wait. When the tomatoes were ripe, all the tomatoes had to be processed. There was no setting it aside for a more convenient weekend. The stove ran all day. The kitchen was hot regardless of the weather outside. The work was exacting and could not be interrupted. And at the end of it, if every lid had clicked, the pantry shelves were lined with jars, row after row of sealed glass catching the light, each one a specific night in January when no one was going to go hungry. That click of a sealing lid was not just a sound, it was the sound of the winter taken care of.
Every summer and fall, something happened in American kitchens that consumed weeks of work and filled an entire pantry shelf: canning. The home canning of fruits and vegetables was not a hobby in 1925. It was the primary means by which a household ensured that it would have produce through the winter. Without a mechanical freezer, which did not exist in household form until the late 1930s, and with a refrigerator that was still a luxury beyond reach, the only way to preserve the summer's tomatoes, green beans, corn, peaches, and berries for winter was to seal them in glass jars and boil them. The mason jar, patented by John Landis Mason in 1858 and still in production by 1925, was the essential vessel. Vegetables were blanched, packed, sealed, and processed in a boiling water bath for the specified time, different for each vegetable and critical to get right. Underprocessing risked spoilage. Improperly sealed jars could develop Clostridium botulism, the bacterium that produced botulism toxin, a real danger that home canners of the era knew about and feared. The difference between a safe seal and a dangerous one was not always visible until the jar was opened. A full canning season produced dozens, sometimes hundreds of jars. Tomatoes alone, for a family that relied on them through winter soups and stews, might require 30 to 50 quarts. Green beans, corn, peaches, applesauce, pickles, each vegetable had its season and its preservation window. When the tomatoes were ripe, all the tomatoes had to be processed. There was no waiting for a convenient weekend. In the kitchen during canning season, the stove ran all day. Large enameled canners sat on the burners, with jars submerged in boiling water. The kitchen was hot, regardless of outside temperature. The work was precise and could not be interrupted. And at the end of it, if everything had gone right, the pantry shelves were lined with sealed jars representing the entire vegetable calendar of the household, the garden's output translated into winter food.
One of the most striking things about the 1925 kitchen is not how much labor it required, but how much knowledge. Making bread required understanding yeast, how it behaved in warm water, how it smelled when it was alive, how long it needed. Making pie crust required understanding fat and flour, the ratio, the temperature, what overworking did to gluten. Making jam required understanding sugar concentration and the gel point of pectin. Making stock required time and patience and knowing what to add and what to leave out. None of this knowledge came on a package label. It was transmitted from person to person, usually from mother to daughter, beginning early. By the time a woman of the 1920s was running her own household, she had typically spent years in the kitchen as apprentice, sous chef, and eventually co-cook before she took over the management of a kitchen herself. The knowledge was embodied in her hands, in her ability to read the surface of a bread dough and know whether it needed more flour, in her ability to hear a pie crust becoming golden in the oven before she could see it. The home economics movement of the early 20th century tried to formalize this knowledge, to write it down, quantify it, and standardize it. The effort produced real benefits. Nutrition science improved the quality of family meals, hygiene science reduced foodborne illness, time and motion studies pointed out inefficiencies in kitchen layout and workflow that individual housewives had been living with for decades without examining. But something was also being formalized away. When cooking knowledge is recorded in a book, it can be followed by someone who never observed the original practice. When the recipe says a heaping tablespoon, it loses some of the hand that originally heaped it. The knowledge that lived in the kitchen in 1925 was precise in ways that instruction could not fully capture, and would not need to as long as someone was there who already knew.
By 1925, electricity had reached approximately half of all American homes. In urban areas, the figure was much higher. In rural areas, much lower. Many rural households would not have electricity until the Rural Electrification Act of 1936 began extending the grid to farms and small towns that private utilities had no economic incentive to serve. But where electricity had arrived, the kitchen began to change, quietly, in stages, through the introduction of single appliances rather than a wholesale transformation of how the kitchen worked. The electric toaster appeared for home use in the 1920s. The automatic pop-up version from the Waters Genter Company debuted in 1926. The electric coffee percolator was available. A few homes had electric waffle irons. Electric mixers existed for home use, though they were expensive enough to remain uncommon in most households. The electric range, a full stove with electric burners and oven, was technically available by 1925, but would not achieve widespread adoption until the 1930s. The appliances that arrived first were the ones that performed a single, discrete task better than the manual alternative: toast the bread, perk the coffee, mix the batter. They did not transform the kitchen, they made small pieces of it easier. The broader transformation, the electric refrigerator replacing the icebox, the electric stove replacing the gas or wood range, the electric mixer replacing hand labor for every batter and dough, was still coming, arriving in pieces through the late 1920s and the 1930s. What electricity promised, and would eventually deliver, was not just convenience, but the severing of the kitchen's dependence on judgment and knowledge. An electric stove with a dial set to 350 degrees did not require the cook to read the fire. A refrigerator with a thermostat did not require the cook to track the ice. The accumulation of knowledge in the hands and eyes of the person running the kitchen would gradually become less necessary as machines took over the monitoring, the temperature management, and the timing. In 1925, that future was arriving but had not yet arrived. The kitchen was still a room that required someone who knew what they were doing.
Morning, Bill.
Hello, George. Late today. Clocked in yet?
It is worth being precise about what the 1925 kitchen demanded, because the numbers are startling. 53 hours per week was Maud Wilson's average for housework broadly. Cooking, meal preparation, and kitchen cleanup accounted for a substantial fraction of that. Research from the period and from subsequent analysis of time use data suggests that cooking alone occupied somewhere between 2 and 4 hours per day in the average 1920s household, more in households that baked their own bread and did significant canning. Consider what that meant across a year. At 3 hours per day, cooking and kitchen management occupied roughly 1,000 hours annually. That is 25 40-hour work weeks, a full-time job and a half, performed without pay, without defined hours, without sick leave, and without the option of stopping because something needed to be on the table. This was understood to be women's work, not by biology, but by an accumulation of cultural, economic, and legal arrangements that made it extremely difficult for women to be anything other than the person running the kitchen. The 1925 housewife was not, in most cases, a woman who had freely chosen cooking as her primary occupation. She was a woman for whom no other full-time occupation was readily available, and for whom the management of food, shelter, and family was simultaneously assumed to be simple and treated as essentially invisible. The home economics movement tried to make it visible, to count the hours, quantify the labor, and argue that the management of a household was a skilled profession deserving of education and respect. Maud Wilson's study was exactly this, an attempt to make the invisible labor of the kitchen legible enough to be improved. Her conclusion that appliances, domestic help, and proper training would improve housewives' experiences was also a quiet statement that the current situation required improving. Few women at the time could afford any of the 3 things she recommended.
That kitchen has not been replaced. It has been made unrecognizable. Every major change that separated it from what we use today arrived in a sequence that took roughly 40 years to complete. The electric refrigerator in the 30s, the electric stove as standard in the 40s and 50s, commercial frozen food in the late 40s, the dishwasher through the 50s and 60s, the microwave in homes by the 70s. And then the long, steady expansion of prepared food, processed food, delivered food, each decade moving a larger share of the kitchen's former production out of the kitchen entirely. Each change reduced the time required. Each reduced the skill required. Each reduced the physical labor required. The kitchen that once demanded 53 hours of a woman's week now, by most measures, takes closer to 30. And that includes the time spent ordering delivery or picking up something already made. We gained time. That is real, and it is not nothing.
But before you close the chapter on that kitchen, consider what was actually happening inside it. The woman making bread was not just making bread. She was reading the dough, pressing a finger into its surface and knowing, from the way it pushed back, whether it was ready. She was holding her palm inside the oven to read the heat. She was listening for the sound of a crust reaching color. She was watching a row of mason jars cool on a cloth, one by one, waiting for each lid to click down and tell her the winter was handled. That presence generated knowledge. And that knowledge was alive, passed hand to hand, kitchen to kitchen, through 100 bread days and 100 canning seasons, accumulating in people's hands and eyes and instincts over generations. Modern kitchens are unambiguously better at every measurable thing: speed, safety, consistency, ease. There is no honest argument against that. But there is a question worth sitting with, even if you don't answer it right away. Think about the last time you ate something that tasted like someone had been completely present while they made it. Not necessarily better, just different. Like the attention was still in it. That's what's hard to buy at the store. Not the recipe, the attention.